A very warm welcome to my community. I'm Sherwood McCaskey, as always. I'm pleased that you have joined us. This week I begin with a thankful heart. I wish to pause to acknowledge the People's Market for its continued support of this program and, by extension, its commitment to Barbadian history, Barbadian culture and Barbadian heritage. We thank you. Now, when the people of St. Catherine's invited us into their community here in St. Philip 3 weeks ago, our first program established that the church was indeed an integral part of this community ever since November the 26th, 1922, when it was consecrated and set apart as a house of worship and a place for divine healing and succor. In this, the final episode in the mini-series on this community, we take a closer look at the church's contribution to the community, the entire area. It's over to you, Mr. Griffith, who is the community's historian.
I always was part of this church. My great-grandfather, Fitzherbert Griffith, they call him Fitz the Staff. He was a church army captain. He could not read nor write. But my mother would tell me that he would make them read the Bible to him. And in reading the Bible, if they came across one of those big words that they couldn't call, they would just say something, blah, blah, blah. And he said, no, go back. What is that word? And he knew. Could not read all right, but he knew the scripture. His wife was Catherine Griffith. And she was one of the people in the community who, if there was a row, she would get into it. She went to her grave with a knee, which gave her a lot of trouble, especially in her old age. A man was beating his lady or wife or what, a woman, and she intervened and got the stick lash on her knee. And she had that knee as a problem always. So their own children, like my grandmother, Eunice Butcher, and Alice Griffith and Mabel Butcher, where that font is, and where those stairs are, there were 3 little pews, short pews, facing each other. And they would always sit in those pews, no place else. But they would come on a Saturday, and they would sweep the church from the road right up. And they could spend half day doing it, because they were not only sweeping, they were talking and reminiscing. They wrote my mother into it at a later stage. So those were the people. So my roots are buried here, and I remember my confirmation, 1960. And we were perhaps the longest confirmation class in the history of this church, because the bishop retired while we were still in the class. And we had to wait until Louis Evans, a Jamaican who became Bishop of Barbados, to come to confirm us. And right away, even before confirmation, I was an altar server. Canon Bradford insisted that once we were here, the servers operated out of that room, and you had to come and clean the brass, and you had chores to do. And if you did not do it, you were held accountable. And if you were on the confirmation class and didn't come to church, you had to say why. All the boys aspired to becoming servers in the church. And not anybody could be a server. You couldn't be a person who was cursing or swearing or doing anything, throwing rocks at people's dogs and so on. You couldn't do that, because news always reached the priest. And when you were coming on the confirmation class, of course, there was a thing called confession. You had to confess. And very often, the boys would rehearse what they were going to say. So you're going to this very serious confession, and you would have to say all of the sins you committed. But the fellas done knew what they were going to say. And when we came out, we would compare notes as to what questions were asked and what answers did we give, and whether the Lord will forgive us. So yes, you were doing the serving. So I was a server even before I was confirmed. And I mentioned earlier that I was confirmed 1960. And after Canon Braffett left, a priest from Codrington College came to run the church for a time. And then I remember he felt that there should be more participation. And 3 of us were appointed as lay readers. It was Neville Maxwell, who was then a political force in Barbados. So Neville Maxwell became one. Pearson Stewart, who was the scout leader, and he also sang in the choir, he was one, and then I was the 3rd lay reader. And I was in from 1970 until now. I must say that in between those years, though, I served abroad and various things and so on, but now I promised the priest that I will come back faithfully and take my position in that stall there, which is still my stall. Once I come to church, nobody will sit there, and I will do what I have to do in the church. In the earlier days, the lay readers would conduct funerals if the priest wasn't present. And I remember, and this would be in the late 50s, George Butcher. He was the first lay reader that I know about. He was a tall, very quiet, soft-spoken fellow. And in those days, he had, we call it a freight cart, but nowadays the people call it a dray cart. And he would haul canes, take canes to the factory. But outside of that, he was sexton of the church and lay reader as well. Would ring the bell. I lament very much that we do not get the bell ringing the way the bell used to be rung. 1 hour before the start of the service, you heard the bell. You could hear the bell all up in Marlville and East Point. And then just as the service is about to begin, about 5 minutes, then the bell would go again. Some churches still do this, but it does not happen here as often as I would like. I don't know, it has to do with the energy level of the sexton, but we would have to pump him up so that he can get back to doing that. And that is what we were involved in those days. And Neville Maxwell would come. I mean, he was the big speaker of the house and so on. And he would put on, he always wore white. We generally wore black and white, but at Easter and so on, we would wear white. We had 2 sets of robes and so on. And he was very popular in the church. And everybody, anybody who was anybody, would aspire to serve in those positions. Iris Gay was the Sunday school superintendent. She was also the music teacher at the school, and she was also the organist. I remember, I think it was Tuesday and Thursday after lunch. The whole school would be involved in singing. And you learn all of those songs, lengthy songs, and we had to memorize them. And Miss Iris will have her bamboo in her hand, and she will come around. And if you were singing in any discordant tones, you could expect a visit from the bamboo. And we accept it at that time, but that is how it was. And you had to learn. The school had a very active drama section. I acted the part of Mark Anthony in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. And you have to stand up on the bench and you recite. This was for the school drama festival. And officials will come up to hear you to see if you were getting to finals and so on. And we learned those speeches by heart. We had to learn poems like The Daffodils by Rudyard Kipling. And all of those we learned. And sometimes when I just remember, I just would recite those poems.
Many of us recall those days of reciting poetry and public speaking, and how those exercises develop in us an appreciation for elocution. Now, the church is a community of people, and when life's journey is ended, the church carries out a set of rituals as it closes the gap between the death that happens and the death that matters. It is how we assign meaning to our remarkable histories and the rituals we devise to conduct the living and the beloved and the dead from one status to another. The church provides that final resting place. In fact, within this churchyard are the stories of hundreds of individuals who fashioned and shaped the lives of others, who inspired many, and more importantly, who left this community of St. Catherine better than how they found it. Their stories will live on as long as we have memory.
We don't like to talk about death, but the cemetery is a community area down there. And we sure do have a lot of persons within this community whose loved ones have been buried there. And we are now putting up our wall of remembrance so they can remember their loved ones. So that if you have a funeral here, it's a big thing.
Now there are very limited graves in this churchyard. And Albertine Haynes, where that white cross is, she is the lady who made the bread and the fish cakes and the mobby. She died at 103. And this is her grave here. And since then, one or two family members went in, died in 2001. And the graveyard beyond, Iris Gay, who was the organist and so on, those are in there. Gwyneth Harewood, who was head of the church army, she is down there. Sandra Mason's mother is down there close to the wall. My mother's there where those flowers are. And Joseph Mason from Bayfield, all of those popular fellas. Now, we spoke about St. Catherine's Club and about Selwyn Blaze. He is in one of these graves here. Good. And Lyle Clark is in here. He's in that one across there. And his wife and his son, Trevor, went in there recently. And we talk about Ammon Stewart, who made all the corn flour and so on. He is buried in this grave site here that belonged to the Marshalls from East Point. So he is on that southern side of that grave. And then very prominent people again were the Bells and the Seeleys. Millicent Seeley, she was one of the Mothers Union leaders. She is in here. And her husband, Arthur Seeley, who used to be a policeman, and he would go to the beach very often. Religiously, he would go to the beach and so on. And it is alleged that he served for many, many years in the police force but never arrested anyone, because he was the kind of peacemaker. Rudolph Seeley, he is the son of Iris Seeley, and he is buried in here as well. He died fairly young, but he was a very prominent and promising member of the society. Now, Iris Bell, she was Edmund Bell's wife. She was buried here along with other members of the family, and one of her daughters as well was buried in here. And of course Henry Seeley and Miss Welch, they're all related. We spoke about Elman Wedderburn earlier, and her sister Jessie Wedderburn is buried here right next to Porter. Porter was a very colourful personality around St. Catherine's. He served abroad in the military and so on, and he had the loudest voice you could ever find. I mean, if there was a political meeting and the current went off, you could ask Porter to speak. And he was a faithful follower of St. Catherine's, and don't engage him in an argument, because if you can't win the argument on the basis of points, he will win on volume. Yes. And then this is the Grisettes. Edwin Grisette, with that little car that he had there, his sons are very active in the church now. Carson and Pearson and Reggie and so on. Edwin Grisette lived to be well over 90 years old, 96 or so, I think. Now, he was a fellow when the school or the church or the men's fellowship had a concert. He could recite poems that were 14 verses long without skipping a beat. And he learned all those as a boy. No, seriously. And people went just to hear Edwin. And he could give you some of the most humorous of poems. He was in there, his cousins there, and then Rupert Seeley. He was one of the Seeleys as well. Sister Grace. Grace was the sister of Sleepy Smith and those very faithful members of the church over all the years, so the two of them are resting peacefully in this area. The policy of the church now is that there are to be no more graves up here, and in fact the church's policy is that there are to be no more casing of graves. You can put up a headstone with permission. And I think that is a good thing, because as you can see, when the gardener is cutting, he has to cut around them, and even if he did a good job, graves that are cased in, he can't get in there with the equipment and so on. And I think that this is beautiful, that the church is on this brow, and the cemetery is just below there at another level. And the graveyard has been expanded over a number of years, but it was never all out here. And boys were very afraid in those days to pass the graveyard, because you had a grove of bamboo trees and frangipani and casuarinas growing on both sides of the walkway through the middle of the cemetery. And I won't say allege, I know that when some people were passing the graveyard, from the time they get to the church entrance, they pick up speed and sprinted past, because nobody wanted to pass the graveyard. People always felt that something would happen to you if you passed there. And there was a lady living right next there. I own the property there now, the church, called Miss Waddle. She was one of the teachers at the school, and her husband was one of those sugar boilers that came from Guyana. Now that property was a very interesting property, because it had a fireplace and a chimney. And underneath the main building, you had as much living space as you had on top. Had those Demerara windows and so on. And when I took over the property, I got a fellow whose name was Penny Malt. I don't know if he's living or dead. I did not know when Penny Malt came with the front end loader to clean up all of those overgrown trees and so on for me, that Penny Malt had first stopped at Volley's shop in Blades Hill, in Trousers Hill. Volley recently died, and may he rest in peace. And Penny Malt had a few drinks. So while he was maneuvering, he struck the corner of the house and knocked it in. I went to the trouble of asking Busy Williams to have a look and so on. He said, well, look, in those days, those houses had no ring beam. Part of it was rubble wall, and part of it was coral stone. So really and truly, so in the end we had to demolish the place. So that would have been a beautiful piece of our heritage to be maintained. And there were two large mango trees there, that and an almond tree that the boys from the school would want to raid. And Miss Waddle would always keep an eye out for the boys. And she was a diminutive lady, wear these round glasses, and in those days, because she used a wood fire, her clothes were always, you know, fairly dark. And the boys would tiptoe into the yard, and as soon as you were about to pick up, Miss Waddle would rush out on you, have to take off. So we had all of those, and people were literally afraid of Miss Waddle. But she was a gentle old lady who had these lovely mango trees and this almond tree, which were they always seemed to be loaded with ripe fruit. But she guarded that jealously, and the school took a very firm stand. So if you went on Miss Waddle's tree, and she would come and complain to the headmaster, and you'd be in serious trouble.
The story of Miss Warren, her mango and almond tree. There seemed to have been a Miss Warren in almost every Barbadian community at that time. And those experiences of the boys were all part of the development of youngsters. The church St. Catherine sits on a mound in this community. Needless to say, it is a point of vantage. From this point, you're able to see
Bailey's great house, where Eddie Grant is living now. But Major Peebles lived there. Those were the benefactors who contributed to St. Catherine's Club in the early days, and the King George V Memorial Park. So you can see Bailey's there, and beyond that would be Maps. And then you have Golden Grove and River. So you had many plantations in this area. So all the people, and if you look to the north, you can see St. Mark's pivoted right there, that white building. You can see that St. Mark's Church. So basically we are in a very good position here, and the persons who selected this as a spot for the church, if you know, this church was completed in 1922. But before the renovation of the roof, as boys we would come and you could look up into the ceiling of the church and you could see white footprints. Yes, footprints white, believed to be people who step into white lime or marl. And there are lots of people like Mama Garns, who was the mother of Darky Cossey. We heard her real name is Carlotta Cossey. Those were the people who headed sand and marl from the beach, Baker's Beach and so on, right down here to build this church. So this is a genuine community church. So every time you look up and you saw those footprints, we remember those people who would travel that distance barefooted with a big bag of sand or marl on their head, or maybe a dung basket of sand or marl on their heads to build this church here. But with the renovation, all of that went. And there was a time when we had a belfry there, a bell at the top where that cross is. And when the renovation was done, they did not put back the bell. They put the bell at a lower level. And I regret that very much because, you know, it has taken away from the original state of the church. But 100 years and we don't know what would happen another 100.
Well, the series My Community concerns itself with looking back and drawing on those wonderful experiences of the past. However, this time around we would provide an opportunity to look forward, because the priest in charge, the Reverend Rosalind Harper Johnson, who incidentally is the first female priest here, she provides an answer to Mr. Griffith's uncertainty as it relates to the next 100 years.
My vision here for St. Catherine is that we launch out in full using the information given and our own unique style for this community of St. Catherine, this area. Because all communities are not the same. And you would have heard from Mr. Griffith how there's a very strong family ties, very, very strong family ties within this community. And so now we're coming out of post-COVID, this post-COVID period. That is the vision, to invite people to come back, to let them know that it is safe, one, and two, that we still have a job to do within this community.
Let us step back again and consider one of the old customs of the church, which thankfully is no longer practiced because it segregated the infant child as if he were responsible for his circumstance of birth.
One of the, I wouldn't say negative thing, but one of the things that the church would still need to explain was that if you were the child of a married couple, your christening was on a Sunday evening. If you were the child of a bastard, as it was called in those days, your christening was on a Wednesday morning. And people didn't seem to see that as discrimination. People took it in their stride and move on. But I was one of those who was christened on a Wednesday morning. And I remember, you know, fondly the role this church has played. And my wish is that this church now will continue to adapt to suit this time that we're in, this 21st century Barbados. And yes, some of the traditions, we need those traditions, they are stabilizing. I love the music. Don't tell me anything that Anglican music dead. I love the singing, I love the hymns, I love the psalms, I love the organ music, I love the tradition. But there are things that we can do still to make sure that our presence in the community is felt and understood. by the now generations.
Wonderful. It's making yourself relevant and being responsive to the times. The community members here love this community. They understand and appreciate those symbols that bring meaning to their lives and are prepared to defend them if need be.
The people in this area should not be taken for granted. You see where we are here, this was dismantled one time. I remember, we had a young priest, I won't call his name, very dynamic young priest and so on. And he wanted to bring about some change. And one night I came home, and I lived just across there, and I noticed there was light in the church, and I did not remember that anything was happening at the church. So I drove up here at the church. Lo and behold, when I came to the church, I walked 2 or 3 pews, and I see people dismantling this and taking down all these statues and so on. And I sat down there, I said nothing. The fellows who were here said that when they saw me coming, they said, "Oh, Lord George." I turned as red as a cherry, they said. Could not believe it. I went back home and realized that there was no faculty applied for or granted. Now, if you want to change anything in these churches, you must have what is called a faculty, where the Synod Council the people must be involved, and the Synod Council must say. And I objected all the way up to the bishop. And a meeting was called right here in the church to discuss this. It was already done. It was already done. And I knew that the people who felt strongly about it would come out to that meeting. And those who were neither here nor there would hardly come. So the debate started. The explanation was given, and I said my piece. And I remember a woman, she got up, very shy. She said, "Well, I don't have anything to say, but I remember when I get married, I stand up right under that day in 1931. And when the vote was taken, well, the priest relocated to another country. And this had to be put back up. Critchlow, a man named Mr. Critchlow, who was very active in the men's fellowship. Not Clarence Critchlow, I remember Mr. Critchlow. He put this back up. Because the people in this community, whereas they want change, they don't want change for change's sake, and the proper process must be followed. And that is why I love these people in this community so much. And I like to boast that I contested elections several times and have always won this PC3 community. They've always supported me, and I always support them. And the community has changed. And whereas we say the extended family has changed, the extended family is still alive, because grandmothers might be living elsewhere, but they can still exercise influence because you have the technology now. So I say hail St. Catherine's and its contribution to the development of this country. I do not think that these churches get the credit that is due, but these churches across Barbados held their communities together. They inspired young men and women who otherwise may have gone astray. And I do know that the counseling that people get and the pastoral support they get go a long way towards keeping this community stable. So that is my 2 cents worth.
Oh no, Mr. Griffith, your contribution is worth more than 2 cents. Evidently, you are the local historian of St. Catherine. We thank you for sharing its history and heritage with all of us. This mini-series on St. Catherine celebrated the contribution of this community to Barbados. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Thanks for your time.